Okay, so welcome to this next video in the playlist on asthma. In this video what we're going to discuss is the pathology of asthma. What is it? How does it occur, basically? Okay, so asthma is the topic for this video. Right, so this is the setup for this video. What we're going to discuss. We're going to start off with the big picture of what asthma actually is and how it presents and things like that. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take a step back and then look at the process by which asthma actually occurs. Okay, and for this we'll see that there are two main types of asthma, and we're going to discuss one of those types, which is the one that's better understood, which is allergic asthma. Okay, which can then propagate into the other form, which is non-allergic asthma. But there are some people who never have allergic asthma and just go straight to non-allergic asthma, and the pathology of that isn't nearly as well understood. Okay, we'll then discuss the pathology in a stepwise manner. Okay, so let's start off with the big picture of asthma then. And for this we're going to need the structure of a bronchus, okay, because I need to show you where the inflammation in asthma actually is occurring. Okay, so let me draw out a picture of a bronchus. Right, okay, so a good starting point is to draw a tube. Okay, so let's say this is the lumen of our bronchus. Okay, and then lining the lumen you have a layer of epithelial cells. Okay, so I'll put these in here. And the epithelial cells which line the lumen of a bronchus are what are known as columnar epithelial cells. So they're very tall cells, like so. Okay, now interdispersed amongst these columnar epithelial cells you have a type of cell known as a goblet cell, which is a cell which is capable of secreting mucus, and it will be secreting mucus onto the surface of these columnar epithelial cells here. So I'll draw some of these goblet cells in a different colour that we'll just have interdispersed amongst the columnar epithelial cells. So in green I will now highlight the sort of cells which I'm going to call goblet cells. So I'll call this one a goblet cell, this one can be a goblet cell, and this one over here can be a goblet cell. So those aren't epithelial cells, instead they're cells which are secreting this mucus. Okay, right. Now, the columnar epithelial cells are all ciliated, so they have little cilia on their surfaces. So let's draw some of these on. Okay, and the mucus that the goblet cells secrete is going to go onto the surface of the cilia, and the cilia will then gradually beat and they'll waft the mucus up the bronchus to a higher bronchus, and then eventually it will make its way out of the bronchial tree into the trachea, and then it will go up the trachea and through the larynx, of course, and then out of the respiratory tract altogether into the laryngopharynx, and then the mucus will be swallowed. Okay, now this is what's known as the mucociliary escalator, and that's a good key word, so I'll put it over here. Okay, and the role of this mucociliary escalator is to remove dirt and also pathogens from the respiratory tract. Okay, so dirt and pathogens get caught in the mucus that lines the respiratory tract, and then is gradually moved up the respiratory tract and out of the respiratory tract, and then goes down the gastrointestinal tract, the esophagus, and burns in the stomach acid. Okay, so the mucus that these goblet cells are secreting will be put over the surface of these cilia, like so. So here is this green mucus. Okay, and it's on the surface of the cilia, like so. So you have a layer of mucus lining the entire respiratory tract, and then underneath that layer of mucus you'll then have the cilia, and then underneath the cilia will be the rest of these columnar epithelial cells, and that's another key word, so I should probably put that down. Columnar epithelial cells, and they're called columnar because they are like a column, basically. They're quite tall cells. Okay, so they resemble columns. Okay, and then the other key word is that we've got goblet cells, which are these cells in green that are secreting the mucus. Okay, now, what is actually supporting all of these cells? What is supporting these columnar epithelial cells and supporting the goblet cells? What are they actually sitting on? What is holding them in place? Why don't they just fall into the lumen? Okay, well, it's because they're all attached to a very rigid structure known as a basement membrane. Okay, so I'll show this here. So in turquoise, this is the basement membrane that these columnar epithelial cells are all sitting on. Okay, and the goblet cells are all sitting on that as well. Right, and the basement membrane mainly consists of collagen, although it does have other proteins in, such as fibrillin and also laminins, which is what the these columnar epithelial cells are actually attached to. They're attached to the laminins of the basement membrane, which are in the lamina lucida of the basal lamina of the basement membrane. Okay, so underneath the basement membrane, you then have a layer of connective tissue, which will mainly consist of collagen, which is known as the lamina propria. So there's another quite thick layer of connective tissue underneath this basement membrane. So I'll draw this in red. Okay, now this is going to be very, very important. This is where asthma is going to be all about. Asthma is going to be about the lamina propria, the basement membrane, and the epithelium. Okay, so most of the inflammation that occurs is going to occur in this lamina propria. Okay, so this was what we needed to discuss, really. And this lamina propria will have a number of blood vessels in, which are important in obviously supplying nutrients to all the cells around. And the other important thing that the lamina propria has in it is a cell type known as a mast cell. So we'll put some of these on. So let's say this is a mast cell here. So I'll label this up even. Okay, so we'll say this is a mast cell. Okay, and we'll also have some blood vessels on here. So I'll give that a nucleus so it's distinguishable as a cell. And then let's put some blood vessels here. And that's why I needed to do something to distinguish that as a cell, because these look like cells as well. Okay, and these will represent the blood vessels that are in the lamina propria. So this entire layer here of connective tissue underneath the basement membrane, like so, is known as the lamina propria. Okay, now, underneath the lamina propria then, what do you have after this? Well, after the lamina propria, what you have is a layer of smooth muscle cells. Okay, so I've drawn the lamina propria in red, so I can't now draw the smooth muscle cell layer in red, although that would have been sort of like the obvious colour to use. So I'll use dark purple for the smooth muscle cell layer, which is surrounding the lamina propria, okay? So, the smooth muscle cell layer consists of rings of smooth muscle cells that surround the whole bronchus, basically. So, let me draw this down here. So, if you can imagine, if this is a smooth muscle cell here, then what will happen is they'll be joined tip to tip, like so. So you'll have another one like so, and you'll have another one like this, and they'll form a complete ring, okay? And this ring has gone a little bit of an odd shape just because I'm trying to fit it in without bashing my hand into the support for the camera, okay? But the point is, the important thing to understand is what's going to happen if all of these smooth muscle cells in this ring of smooth muscle cells contract. Okay, so if all of them contract, then their lengths all get smaller. Okay, and if all of them get shorter, then that means that the whole circumference of this ring is going to get smaller. Okay, now when the circumference of a ring gets smaller, that means that the diameter of that ring must also get smaller. So, simple experiment. Here is a large circumference ring. Reduce the circumference of the ring, and the diameter also gets smaller. So you constrict the ring of smooth muscle cells, basically. Now, if the layer of smooth muscle cells is constricting, then that's going to be transferred to these inner layers, so the whole bronchus is going to end up constricting. So, these smooth muscle cells control the diameter of the lumen of the bronchus, basically. Okay, and this is going to be very important. These smooth muscle cells are going to play a very important role in the pathology of asthma. Okay, then surrounding the smooth muscle cell layer is a layer known as the submucosa. Okay, so let me draw this like so. Okay, so all the way around now, what we have is a layer known as the submucosa. Now, this isn't going to play a very active role in asthma, not compared to the lamina propria and the smooth muscle cell layer, but just for completeness, we'll put this on here. Okay, so this is not a layer that's going to become inflamed. It's the lamina propria, the basement membrane, and the epithelium that's going to become inflamed. Okay, the submucosa isn't going to become inflamed. So, what we have in the submucosa is a bunch of glands. So I'll put these here. Okay, so these are tubes that are lined again by columnar epithelial cells, this time which are not ciliated. Okay, but these columnar epithelial cells are also secreting mucus. Okay, so you've got these tubes of cells which are secreting mucus, and the mucus will go into the lumen of these tubes, and then these tubes will eventually join. They'll penetrate through these the smooth muscle layer, the lamina propria, and then they'll be continuous with the epithelium, and the basement membrane will also be continuous. Okay, so they'll come up and empty onto the surface, and they'll empty their mucus out onto the surface. So it's not just the goblet cells which produce mucus. These submucosal glands are also very important in producing mucus here. Okay, and this layer underneath the smooth muscle cell layer, which contains these submucosal glands, is what is known as the submucosa. Okay, so this is the submucosa. Right, then, surrounding the submucosa, what you then have is sheets of collagen. Cartilage. Okay, so you don't have one entire confluent layer of cartilage surrounding the entire bronchus. Instead, if you look at it in cross-section, what you'll have is sheets or plates of cartilage. Okay, and these are known as interconnected plates. Okay, and the type of cartilage that you have here is hyaline cartilage. Okay, so these are the plates of cartilage here. Okay, so I'll colour these in a special colour so they can be in blue. Okay, so these are sheets or plates of hyaline cartilage. Right, now it's better to see this from a different view because it's difficult to understand what this actually means. Why is it not fully encirculating the bronchus? So it's better to see it from a side view. So let's draw our bronchus from the side. Okay, now drawing a tube again is a good start. Okay, so we're now not looking at a cross-section, we're looking at it as an intact, tube, okay? Now, basically, if we're looking at the cartilage is the outermost layer, basically, of the bronchus. So, what you'll see on the surface here will be things like this. You'll see a meshwork of cartilage that sort of goes maybe like this, okay? So this is the cartilage here, in blue. Okay, now you do have portions of the bronchus where there is no cartilage surrounding it. So all of these pieces here, these are portions where the submucosa will be exposed. You won't have any cartilage surrounding it, but you can see that the cartilage sort of is all interconnected in a sort of meshwork around the bronchus. Okay, and you can hopefully understand how if we were to take a cross-section, if we were to cut through here, you'd have portions where there were cartilage that you would see in the cross-section, such as here, down here, and then portions where there would be no cartilage, such as up here. Okay, so that's the structure now of a bronchus. So, let's now talk about the big picture of what happens in asthma. So, asthma is a chronic inflammatory disease of the mucosa of bronchi. Okay, now the mucosa means all of the stuff, including the actual mucosal epithelium here, so these epithelial cells here, along with the basement membrane, along with the lamina propria, all of that is the mucosa. So all of this together is the mucosa. So asthma is a chronic inflammatory disease of the mucosa. Okay, and what happens, what it's characterized by, is that you get recurrent, what are known as asthmatic attacks. So if you have asthma, from time to time you will get what's known as an asthmatic attack. Okay, and this is the characteristic symptom of asthma. Okay, now asthmatic attack. Asthmatic attacks are also known by the old name status asthmaticus. Okay, so when you're in the state of having an asthmatic attack, it's known as status asthmaticus. Okay, right, so what happens in an asthmatic attack? Well, basically what happens is you get occlusion of the bronchi. Okay, so the smooth muscle that lines the bronchi, this begins to contract in an asthmatic attack, okay, which constricts the bronchi. In addition, all of these capillaries here, they're going to undergo the inflammatory response, basically. So they're going to start recruiting. Well, firstly, they're going to vasodilatate to increase the blood flow here. They're going to become leakier. They're going to allow the formation of an inflammatory exudate, which will swell the lamina propria up, basically. And they'll also start recruiting leukocytes from the blood, which will also help in the swelling. So you're also going to get swelling of the lamina propria, basically, as these capillaries undergo the acute inflammatory response. Okay? So, both of these things, both the contraction of the layer of smooth muscle cells of the bronchus, along with the swelling of the lamina propria, are going to constrict this lumen and lead to obstruction. Okay, and this is what happens in an asthmatic attack. Now, what triggers an asthmatic attack? So why aren't asthmatic people always having asthmatic attacks? When actually do they have them? Because they're not having them always. They'll have them from time to time, basically. Well, this is the difference between what is known as allergic asthma and non-allergic asthma. Okay, so confusingly, there are absolutely loads of different names for this. So allergic asthma and non-allergic asthma are the two main names that are used now, and they're the ones which make the most sense, but there are still old names which are used. Okay, so people will also refer to allergic asthma as extrinsic asthma. Okay, and then they'll refer to non-allergic asthma as intrinsic asthma. Okay, in addition, there's another name that can be used. You can also refer to allergic or extrinsic asthma as atopic asthma, and then non-allergic asthma as non-atopic asthma. So these are just names for the same thing, basically. We will use the allergic and the non-allergic asthma names. Okay, but you will hear clinicians still use extrinsic, intrinsic, and some will still use atopic and non-atopic. Okay, so what is the difference? Well, in allergic asthma, your asthmatic attacks will be triggered by allergens, basically. So if you inhale allergens into your airway. Now, what are allergens? Well, allergens are proteins that you have initiated an humoral adaptive immune response against, which you shouldn't have. It's a hypersensitivity reaction. Okay, so that's a good word. So this is a hypersensitivity reaction. Now, a hypersensitivity immune reaction is when you initiate an adaptive immune response against, or in fact an innate immune response as well, either of them. Okay, when you initiate an immune response against something that is innocuous. Okay, so it's not an autoimmune reaction. An autoimmune reaction is when you actually initiate an immune response against a protein that is actually found within your body. Hypersensitivity reactions are where you initiate an immune response against an external protein, a protein that is not within your body. Okay, but it's innocuous. It is not a pathogen. You should not initiate an immune response to it. It's completely unnecessary. Okay, so what sort of proteins can can correspond to allergens. So what proteins are capable of causing immune responses in some people, which are really quite innocuous? Okay, so the common one, the main one, is pollen. Pollen is very capable of initiating immune responses, even though it's pretty innocuous. As far as we can tell, we cannot see what is harmful about pollen and why the body should be initiating an immune response against it. Okay, but it is a very common allergen. In addition, maybe a little bit more understandable as to why the body might think it's something bad, certain proteins that are made by house dust mites. Okay, so in your house you will have dust, presumably, somewhere, and basically there are tiny little mites known as house dust mites which live on the dust and they eat the dust. So the dust is dead cells, basically, generally dead skin cells from us humans, or if you've got other pets, from those as well. And these house dust mites, they love dust and they destroy it, basically. They eat it. And they live on it. So house dust mites will have all sorts of proteins associated with them. They're little animals, okay? And you can inhale the proteins from these house dust mites. And most of us will not initiate an immune response against these proteins. However, some people do, and that is an allergic response. Most of us have learnt, well, our immune systems have learnt that that is not something that should have an immune response initiated against it. Although it's more understandable why this should have an immune response initiated against it, because, you know, if you had one of these inside your body, you would most definitely want to initiate an immune response against it. So this one's more understandable, but most people will not initiate immune responses against house dust mite proteins. So, we do not understand why some people are allergic to these, why some people initiate very powerful immune responses against pollen and house dust mite proteins, but it seems to be genetic, basically. We don't understand the pathology. Okay, but we will just start off from the assumption that we're going to initiate an immune response against these, and we won't discuss actually why some people do and some people don't, because it simply is not understood. Okay, and then there's non-allergic asthma, which is where the allergic attack, the asthmatic attack, sorry, not the allergic attack anymore, the asthmatic attack, this contraction of the smooth muscle cells and the inflammatory response being initiated where the blood vessels in the lamina propria are all going to vasodilatate to increase vascular permeability and begin leukocyte extravasation. It's not going to be triggered by an allergen anymore. Instead, it's triggered by other things, okay? So, for instance, non-allergic asthmatic attacks can be triggered by things like cold air, okay? Or, and we'll understand cold air. We'll see how, if you suffer from allergic asthma for long enough, it can actually lead to you getting non-allergic asthma, where, for instance, breathing in very cold air will trigger an asthmatic attack, okay? Other things that can produce non-allergic asthma, asthmatic attacks, are environmental pollutants such as sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, okay? Smoking, the horrible chemicals in cigarette smoke can trigger an asthmatic attack. And other things such as viral infection can trigger the asthmatic attack, okay? And also things like exercise and stress and anxiety can also trigger non-allergic asthmatic attacks. And this is why it's called intrinsic, because some of these start from within, basically. Things like stress and anxiety, those are obviously things on the level of the brain that are somehow affecting, leading to the bronchi being affected, basically. Okay, so things like that we're not going to be able to discuss because the pathology of how stress and anxiety can trigger an asthmatic attack just are not understood. But we will get to the point where we can understand potentially why cold air and environmental pollutants can trigger an asthmatic attack, and maybe viral infections as well. Okay, but we're going to start off with allergic asthma, and we're going to see how people who suffer from allergic asthma for a very long time and have asthmatic attack after asthmatic attack after asthmatic attack, what gradually happens is that it damages the bronchi, it damages the epithelium of the bronchi, okay? And this can then lead to the exposure of neurons in the lamina propria to the contents of the lumen of the bronchi, okay? Now, when you've got sensory neurons actually exposed to the lumen, then that can lead to non-allergic asthma, because these sensory neurons will maybe detect cold air. Okay, so some of them may be thermoreceptors. They may detect environmental pollutants, horrible chemicals, or potentially they may respond to viral infection. Okay, and when these sensory neurons are activated, that can then lead to the activation of motor neurons, which innervate the smooth muscle cells, and then, they're not motor neurons in that case, of course, because motor neurons innervate skeletal muscle cells, but it can activate neurons which lead to the contraction of the smooth muscle cells and also the initiation of the inflammatory response in the endothelial cells, and therefore you can get an asthmatic attack from these rather than from the original allergen. Okay, so allergic asthma can then propagate into non-allergic asthma. However, some people never have allergic asthma and just straight away have non-allergic asthma, and that is not understood. Okay, so we're going to look at allergic asthma, how that occurs, and then we'll talk about how it can develop into non-allergic asthma, and we'll begin that in the next video.